Viva la Libertà, Chapter 9. A teacher arrives in class and tells her third graders that it is very important to separate out the blue-eyed kids from the brown-eyed ones. A new study has shown that blue-eyed people are stupid and lazy, and they tell lies. Because they have more melanin in their blood, brown-eyed people are naturally superior. Since these are scientifically established and unchangeable distinctions, the teacher announces that the class must be reorganized. Blue-eyed students cannot drink from the brown water fountain, and they must wear blue stripes around their necks, which only the browns can remove. Browns always rule over blues. Within half an hour, the blue-eyed students begin to cringe and hide. They act like slaves. Brown-eyed kids are the masters, and they know it. This story is true. The day after Martin Luther King was shot, Jane Elliott, a teacher in an all-white Iowa school, tried exactly this experiment. She invented the differences between blue and brown-eyed children and immediately had a classroom of masters and slaves. Every time she had done it since with children and adults, it continues to work. Discrimination and power can separate people into categories that never existed before. And very quickly, masters and slaves take on their rules. We know for it happened all around the world, starting in the 1600s. The Four Pillars and Five Peoples. Following Columbus across the Atlantic, trailing the Portuguese around Africa to Asia, Europeans fanned out to explore the entire planet, going everywhere. From the islands of Polynesia to the mountain kingdom of Tibet, they went to trade, to conquer, to preach Christian faith, and they sent home reports about the people they met. The scholars who tried to make sense of this flood of information about the diversity of human beings were already inclined to think in new ways. Science was opening doors to astonishing new knowledge. Nicholas Copernicus proved that the sun, not the earth, was the center of the solar system. Isaac Newton solved the mysteries of motion. William Harvey traced how the heart pumps blood through our bodies. Apparently, if you could gather enough information about a subject, analyze it objectively, and spell the results in a clear logical system, you could explain anything. This faith in science and systematic thinking, which reached its height in the 18th century, is called the Enlightenment. What a joyous term that is! Clear, free, dazzling light shining on every dark corner of life. A wonderful new day seemed to be dawning. Reason and science would finally sweep away centuries of superstition, intolerance, and cruelty. Each step in challenging existing laws led to another. Why should Jews be excluded from European countries or kept confined in ghettos? Urged on by his American friend Roger Williams, the English Puritan general Oliver Cromwell brought Jews back to England in the mid-17th century. Until 1669, Jews were not allowed to live in Berlin at all, and were forbidden to work in a long list of occupations, including every profession except medicine. Only 40 years later were the richest Jews granted the right to take off the yellow stars they were required to wear, by paying the modern equivalent of $160,000 each. But when Frederick II, known as Frederick the Great, became the ruler of Prussia in 1740, he announced that all religions must be tolerated, and began corresponding with the best-known French Enlightenment thinkers. As they dismissed the old religious grounds for laws and insisted on governments based on reason, the thinkers of the Enlightenment treated one prejudice after another as a vestige of earlier times that must be discarded. In 1673, a French writer named Francois Poulain de la Barre argued that almost everything known about women must be questioned. We are filled with prejudice, he announced, and we must renounce it absolutely if we are to have a clear and definite knowledge. The French philosopher Charles de Second, Baron de Montesquieu, questioned why the state should execute or even punish homosexuals rather than letting it be a family matter. As Mozart's 1787 opera Don Giovanni happily put it, Viva la Libertà, hooray for freedom. In this atmosphere of reason and free inquiry, it is obvious that the old Bible story of Noah and his 3 sons could not account for the variety of people Europeans were meeting all around the globe. Figuring out the real logic for human differences was a perfect challenge for Enlightenment thinkers. They could sweep away medieval fables, gather data from throughout the world, and arrive at a shining truth. One of the most heartbreaking ironies in this book is that even as Enlightenment thinkers broke the chains of superstition, they forged the iron bonds of race. This is another instance of the pattern in which a step away from one set of prejudices opens the door to newer, even more extreme ones. Unlike Christianity, which is always looking for souls to save, science bases its conclusions on observations of the physical world. It builds up theories based on measurements, then tests them with controlled experiments. We may not all possess the same brains, the same ability to reason, to work, or to govern ourselves. If that is what rational tests show, no amount of human feeling can make any difference. There is no appeal past grim fact. You can become a Christian, but you cannot convert from defected to dominant. To Enlightenment thinkers, one possible explanation for the variety of human beings was that they were not, in fact, all human. Horses look like zebras, but they are not the same animals. The brilliant Scottish philosopher David Hume claimed that dark-skinned people were of a different, inferior species. I am apt to suspect the Negroes and in general all the other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to whites. Reading Hume, you see one strand in the idea of race fully expressed. Physical difference implied difference in species. For all their focus on reason and science, Enlightenment thinkers had no better explanation for the origin of human beings better than the Bible, so they adjusted the familiar story of Adam and Eve to fit their new theories. If Hume was right, and dark and light-skinned people actually were distant species, then God must have created them separately. Adam was not the father of all, but only of whites. Dark-skinned men and women might resemble whites, but they were actually created at a different time, with different capacities for other reasons. This view was taken very seriously, especially in France from the 1700s to the mid-1800s. The great Swedish botanist Carolus Linnaeus lived in the 1700s and spent his life gathering information about animals and plants from throughout the planet. Then he invented a way of classifying the entire living world. This was the essence of the Enlightenment. He wanted to know everything about living things and then to bring order to what he had learned. To this day, we use the rules and terms he invented to make sense of the whole crawling, floating, flying, and swimming natural world. Linnaeus did not agree with Hume. He thought there were 4 regular types of people and 2 exceptions: wild children reared by wolves and monstrous men. The greatest botanist of all time, a man who shared the planet with Americans' fathers, still believed the ancient stories of monstrous men. In 1775, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, a German scientist and devoted follower of Linnaeus, came up with the most convincing explanation of human diversity. Having carefully examined 82 skulls, he concluded that humanity could be divided into 4 variations, or as others soon put it, races, each with its own physical and temperamental characteristics. He later added a 5th. Blumenbach was sincerely trying to make sense of a confusing world. He dismissed the idea that people with different skin colors were distinct species. You might easily take the inhabitants of Cape of Good Hope, the Greenlanders, and the Circassians for so many different species of man. Like Aristotle, he was certain that all the differences in people could be explained by the climates in which they lived. But he went further than the ancient Greek philosopher. He believed the various groupings of people were constantly changing, evolving, and that under proper conditions, dark-skinned people could become white. In his home, he kept a shelf devoted to books by black authors, and he was especially appreciative of the poems of Phillis Wheatley, the talented American slave. Blumenbach was convinced that his populations were only general categories, and as people intermarried, the groups could blend. For all of his open-mindedness and curiosity, though Blumenbach fell victim to his own prejudices and then treated them as scientific laws. For he found what he considered the most beautiful people in the world near the Caucasus Mountains, what is now the nation of Georgia. He assumed that they, the Caucasians, were the original human beings. The colored races came later, he concluded, as people moved and fell away from their original and pure form. The Caucasians were the oldest and most beautiful race. The Asians and Africans were the most altered. The remaining 2 races, the Malay and the American, were transitional races between the extremes of the others. Just 1 year before the Declaration of Independence, Blumenbach spelled out the modern theory of race. The peoples of the world could be studied by the rules of objective science and then carefully ranked. Race is not just a way to describe skin tone, eye shape, or hair type. It was also a method for mapping out the natural order of the world, which ran down from light to dark. Here were all the central strands of race: physical appearance, inheritance, ranking. While Blumenbach himself believed race was changeable, he was reacting against men like Hume who did not. Looking back at Blumenbach's idea today, it is obviously flawed. In one moment he was using calculators and measuring skulls, in another he was ranking all human beings based on his own personal sense of beauty. Why wasn't that shift from science to prejudice obvious to everyone? Blumenbach was a serious scientist, and his calculations were detailed and exacting. The idea that human beings have evolved into groups with distinct features was, in fact, more precise than the story of Noah and his sons, and the bias in his beliefs only confirmed what many Europeans already felt. It was easy to overlook his switch from thinking to feeling, because what he said sounded so good and felt so right. Blumenbach's theory of race both swept away all previous explanations of human difference and gave a new justification for ancient prejudice. He spoke in the voice of science, not the pride of the Sumerians, Greeks, or Romans, or the belief in being special to God of the Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But all these deeper layers of feelings are there in his theory. We, those like us, those who we find beautiful, are superior. You, those unlike us, those we find alien, are inferior. Because race is presented as science. It silences objections based on feeling. And yet the idea itself is so powerful because it confirms our ancient sense that those who look different are alien, enemies what the Muduruku called Pyrrhot. Say that you think there is no such thing as race, and someone will point to Bidil, the first drug approved by the Food and Drug Administration, specifically for treating African Americans with heart disease. If a drug works for one group and not another, that might seem like pure science, an objective proof that racial differences are real. But then a critic will object that the study actually only showed that betel helped with hypertension, the type of heart disease African Americans tend to have, and very likely they suffer more from hypertension because of centuries of racism and social challenges, not any genetic similarity. The history of racism has real effects that have little or nothing to do with genes. The concept of race stands directly, uncomfortably, on the foundations of both modern science and ancient prejudices. Over the next 170 years, this would have the most grim and bloody consequences.